Funding for American Collection comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the ExxonMobil Corporation, and viewers like you, partners in honoring the best of American literature and drama.
It's a girl, Cora. It's a girl.
Ain't no good come out of white and colored love, Cora.
My baby.
Oh. We don't care what anyone says. We don't care. Oh.
She's so beautiful, Cora.
It's appearing at 10 acres an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year.
You have a place like Detroit that's losing metropolitan population and it's gaining land area. That's sprawl. Detroit lost 7 or 8% of its population and it grew 30% land area. That's sprawl. Cleveland, between 70 and 90, lost 11% of its population and grew 40% of land area. Those places built 2 or 3 new rings of cities to accommodate no new people.
Sprawl is building out the elements that could be used to build towns, but instead of assembling them, they're disassembled. It's like having the ingredients to make an omelet, not making the omelet. You know, having guests over and say, okay, you eat the eggs now, you know, the cheese next, and the salt third.
The ever outward movement of capital and new construction, the ever outward mobility of people has disfigured this landscape and disfigured the communities left behind. And it's that recognition that something is diseased in our society.
Why do we keep expanding with ring after ring of suburbs when we have these empty, hollowed-out urban cores, which have been visited by disinvestment, racial polarization, bad schools, you name it? So I think it doesn't make social, economic, environmental sense to keep expanding.
For every 100 new homes built in the outer suburbs, 67 homes in the city of Detroit are abandoned and eventually boarded up. Sprawl ate the heart of one city after another: Atlanta, Los Angeles, Newark, and Chicago. For 30 years, not a single new housing subdivision was built inside Detroit, while its suburbs boomed. During that time, the combined population of the city and suburbs fell, but Greater Detroit spread out onto 1/3 more land area. A profound physical shift was taking place. Throughout history, the majority of people living in developed societies have lived in either cities or on farms. But by the 1990s, the United States had changed all that. It became the first, with the majority living in suburbs. This critical shift happened in a 50-year burst that followed World War II, a time of unlimited wealth and spending. But why did we make such a radical change? Why did we abandon the city, and at what cost? Cities used to work. By the mid-1800s, they had become centers of American economic and cultural life, melting pots of languages and religions, a cauldron of rich and poor. Chicago, Pittsburgh, Houston, and Denver grew up alongside New York, St. Louis, and San Francisco. By 1910, Detroit was changing life in America with the automobile, and for the next 3 decades, it boomed like no other city. But the product that made the Motor City soon began to unmake it. The car and the freedom it brought led Americans to the countryside, where they discovered a whole new way of life. The story of what happened to Detroit is the story of countless other American cities.
It's always been a dream, particularly in the Anglo-American world, to live on the land, to be landed gentry, to live in a bucolic pastoral setting. Suburbs are not new. Brooklyn was the first suburb, probably in America, across the river from New York, from Manhattan.
By the late 1930s, The United States was leaving the Great Depression only to be plunged headlong into a world war. America's workforce put on the uniform and left for battle.
And when there started to be a labor shortage in Detroit in the 40s with the Arsenal of Democracy, which what Detroit was called, initially Ford, whom, as you know, has a history of being anti-Semitic and racist in many regards, but he did reach out to the black community. He reached out initially to the black leadership and black churches, and there was sort of a patronage. You know, it's like, I need a black worker, and the person would come through the church, and the minister would send forward a worker. Detroit was the land of opportunity. There was good jobs for anybody who wanted. There was racial tension, but there was still a lot of opportunity compared to the South. So the 40s saw a huge transformation, and the number of blacks from 1940 to 1950 doubled in Detroit. You know, during that same period that you had this expansion in terms of population, there was no housing being built. All of our extra energy, if you will, was going to fighting the war. So there was sort of this pent-up demand for housing. So there was a good 10-year period where the fight over space was all inside the city. The city was the suburb.
But it was also the era of segregation. While a small, affluent black community had evolved on Detroit's Lower West Side, most were relegated to a strip just north of the downtown. It was called Black Bottom, named for the loamy, rich soil that the first settlers had found there 300 years before. With its thriving commercial strip of jazz clubs, nightclubs, hotels, and businesses named Paradise Valley, Black Bottom evolved into a self-sufficient oasis of culture and enterprise, a city within a city. It had its own class structure and business community, names like Hawkins, Diggs, Gordy, Love, and Barthwell, doctors' offices, food service delivery, dry cleaners, drugstores, and its very own hospital.
I love Black Bottom. I love Black Bottom. I grew up in Black Bottom. You had more togetherness. You had a time when the men would tip their hats when they saw you. Hello, Miss Jones, or Mrs. Smith, Reverend Franklin, Deacon Jones, what have you.
But initially, yes, you had a very vibrant community, a very intact community, and a community that was relatively healthy.
I remember as a child, I never had a key to our house because we didn't even have to have keys because nobody walked into your house or nobody came in to take anything. So it was different. And on Hastings, there were a lot of stores within a 5-square block area, and they were all owned by blacks. That's why there's so much pride for me in that particular area.
I mean, it's interesting, you know, you sort of hear of the Harlem Renaissance, which was real. Mississippi, the blues coming from the Mississippi Delta to Chicago, the Harlem Renaissance. A lot of people don't realize that Detroit was really the sort of home of jazz. You know, you had a whole vibrant cultural community in place that really stayed there in many ways, probably until the late 60s.
It was beautiful. We had, every club had a show. Every club sold food like chicken in a basket. We were up all night. The shows come on like 9 at night, 10. We do 2 shows a night, 3 on Sunday. The place is full, always full.
But everybody who was anybody in the entertainment industry, Nat King Cole, Dinah Washington, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Fletcher Henderson, you name it, they came to Paradise Valley. It was just a wonderful, beautiful place.
It was just so real. People were good. We had good people. Everybody mingled with everybody. There was no color barrier, nothing like that. Everybody, hi there, hi, good morning. But we can't do that today. That's out. But we had fun.
Gotham Hotel was known as the best hotel for blacks in the world. It had rooms with private baths, which was something new, and everybody from Marion Anderson to Adam Clayton Powell. I used to come, I swear, 4 or 5 times a year. It was just a place where you had a first-class, black-owned hotel.
And the real advantage they had up here was the good paying jobs. People had a lot of money, to spend, and they, by and large, spent it in their own community. And businesses thrived. So I understand that Detroit, during that era, had more businesses operated by blacks than any other city in the country. We had all of the businesses necessary to sustain a community or city within a city.
But good times and the lure of jobs created a housing crisis for blacks. In 1942, the Detroit Housing Commission announced plans for a project in a largely Polish and Italian neighborhood on the city's east side. It was named after Sojourner Truth, a former slave and abolitionist. The all-white neighborhood was infuriated. It began a campaign of intimidation, vowing to keep blacks out. Black families moved in under police escort as a crowd of club-carrying whites jeered. Fighting erupted. 40 people were injured and 220 arrested before police restored order. There would be hundreds such incidents in the coming years. Whites began moving out of town. By June 1943, racial tension over housing was so acute that it ignited into a full-blown riot that left 25 blacks and 9 whites dead, and the city under martial law.
Public housing was initially seen as just a need for housing because there was a huge housing shortage, but soon it became associated with blacks, and there was resistance almost at every turn.
When the Detroit Housing Commission tried to place a project for blacks in the Oakwood community of southwest Detroit, it unleashed a torrent of animosity.
I bet you don't live next door to Negroes. They should be kept in separate communities. Do you want a repetition of the race riots? Mrs. Steve Kadensky.
I believe that there is a place for the Negroes in our city, but I do not believe that we should be made to move from them. You and I know only too well that they are not dependable and hardly a fitting neighbor to raise your children with. Walenti Krawczyk, Sr.
A parish priest came to the support of his white flock.
One can love both cats and dogs, but no sane person would throw a number of both into the same cage and pretend they will get along. Anyway, SBCA would take up the case. Father Henry Fatinelli, Our Lady of Mount Carmel.
In desperation, housing officials endeavored to spread the projects around. When they tried Dearborn, they ran into the city's openly racist mayor.
When you remove garbage from your backyard, you don't dump it in your neighbor's. Orville Hubbard, Mayor of Dearborn.
When the GIs returned from war in 1945, they walked into a volatile combination of scarce housing and racial tension. But they did have the newly passed GI Bill of Rights. For a small down payment and less than it would cost to rent, they could get a brand new home in a development on the edge of the city.
What happened in the United States is that in the post-World War II period, there were hidden subsidies for suburban development. We simply subsidized the highways. We subsidized the FHA mortgages and the VA mortgages, which were only for new construction, not for renovation. So if you had an old house, an old wonderful old Victorian in downtown Cincinnati, say, you were not getting a cheap loan to fix it. You were getting a cheap loan to buy a new one. So we disincentivized the renovation of our cities.
At the same time, the federal government began construction on a massive highway system that would link cities across the country.
Well, the stated purpose, as you know, is a defense purpose, and supposedly Eisenhower saw how difficult it was to move troops, especially in Europe, and realized if there was a national emergency in the United States, we didn't have a system in place to actually move troops.
The interstate system has been the biggest public works project in the history of the world. Massive investment that's been over a generation in the making in the U.S. That's a huge subsidy. Suburbia would have never happened to the extent that it has without that.
We built a velvet highway so that they could live as far away as they could possibly drive. And we opened up a lot of land that heretofore people wouldn't have moved to because it would have been too hard to commute. And eventually, the critical mass of jobs in places like Detroit and the Midwest moved out there, too.
But it was also used to destroy neighborhoods. The siting of highways was a huge issue, and invariably they were sited in poor communities. A lot of those communities were broken up by saying, we need this land, eminent domain, to build a highway, but it was always at the expense of blacks. And so, by and large, the highway system essentially became how to get suburbanites in and out of the city.
And in the process, people tended to find other places to live. Businesses tended not to find other places to do business. So the most obvious victims were the residents, but perhaps the most long-lasting victimization was of the African-American business class and entrepreneurship.
Black Bottom and Paradise Valley disappeared overnight, cleared and buried under the new Interstate 75.
It was falling down, and I don't know how I can say this without sounding a bit bitter and prejudiced myself, and God knows I don't want to be that way. But when the white man got ready to tear up Paradise Valley, they drew up some plans and went straight up Hastings with I-75. That took just about all of Paradise Valley. Prime land in the downtown area. And boom, that was the end of that. Who's going to stand up and fight for the little man who has no voice? When you're little and poor and black, you don't really have a voice. You have a voice, but who's listening to you? And for what reason? Politically, what can they gain from helping you? And basically, they're looking for political gains. Your mayor was white. Your legislators were white. And if this is what they decided they were going to do, so be it. This is what they did.
The community was assaulted. It was attacked, basically, and dispersed. And I'm grappling with this because the enormity is almost impossible to verbalize. It was a village, it was a small city that had problems but had diversity and had strength and had a sense of community that was systematically destroyed. It was destroyed.
When they bulldozed Black Bottom, Detroit officials created a bigger problem. Now where would people live?
Now, of course, this was before 1954, so Jim Crow was still the law of the land. We had explicit segregated housing patterns that was supported by the federal government and by state and local officials. So, I mean, one of the things I often say that the amount of segregation, which actually intensified in the 40s and 50s and 60s, could not have occurred simply based on personal animus. You needed some institutional and structural things in place.
One of segregation's most notorious allies was the Federal Housing Administration, the agency that for decades has financed millions of suburban homes across America.
You know, the history of FHA is really probably one of the sorriest histories in our society in some regards, and yet some historians have said the single most institution in the last 50 years in America has been FHA. And I think both of those statements are probably true. In order to buy a home in the United States, many lenders required that you put 30, 40, or 50% down, and the loan potentially would be amortized within 5 years. Needless to say, most Americans couldn't buy a home. So here comes the federal government, and they say, we're going to change this. You only have to put 10% down, and we're going to give you 25 or 30 years to pay off the loan. But it said, we want you to live in a essentially racial homogeneous community, all white community, and we prefer new construction to existing units, which means out of the city.
So we intervened in the marketplace to help create this. We gave virtually no-cost money to white people to move to white-only suburbs.
The federal government also, with its federal income tax mortgage deduction, tends to favor people who buy homes over renters, which tends to favor suburbanites over to city dwellers.
FHA, which was started in the 30s, picked up the appraisal and lending practice of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which essentially created redlining on a national level. I mean, there was already racial segregation in the housing industry, but it wasn't nationalized, it wasn't institutionalized, it was individuals doing it. It was a lender here doing it or a banker here doing it. The Homeowners Loan Corporation basically nationalized appraising, and it made it a uniform system across the country. It created 4 categories, with green being the best and red being the worst. And one of the things that made a community red was the language was inharmonious racial groups. And what they really meant was non-whites. And in fact, if a community had Jews in it, it could not get the green rating. Any community that had blacks or might have blacks would more often than not get the red rating. And FHA and the federal government went around to lenders and literally showed them how to do what they call residential maps and how to draw red lines around certain areas that weren't safe for loaning money.
In 1949, a white builder asked the FHA to provide mortgages in a new development he wanted to build at Wyoming and 8 Mile Road. When FHA officials learned that the adjacent plots had been owned for 2 decades by black families who used them mostly for vegetable gardening, they turned him down. His property was next to a slum, they said. So, at the FHA's urging, the builder erected a 6-foot concrete wall to separate whites from blacks. The wall still exists, although its origins are now long forgotten. Today it serves as a billboard for public and community art.
In a sense, whites sort of conceded and said, okay, you can have the city, we're leaving. In the 50s and 60s, that started happening.
By the time the Detroit riots erupted in 1967, the city had already shrunk by 1/3. For 20 years, jobs, auto plants, and the tax base had fled with the white working and middle class.
We've helped put out fires, we helped try to keep the riots down and keep the corner clear. But after all, you know, what can we do? What can you say behind all this murdering and confusion? I wish things could be better for the Negro people. Everybody is thieves and murderers and snipers.
Whites were saying, wait a minute, you know, you got to protect us from this really ocean of blacks that are moving into cities and to the north from the south. And so in a way what we did is that we gave blacks civil rights laws and we gave whites white space. We created fragmented metropolitan areas so that whites could be protected from blacks while blacks at the same time had the claim of full participation in society.
When whites reached their new suburban communities, they passed rules to ensure they would not face what they had left. The Grosse Pointe Property Owners Association screened any new resident with a report that asked questions such as, what descent? American-born? Is way of living American? Typical of his own race? Under the heading appearance was the category swarthy and gradings for medium, slightly, and not at all. It asked for evaluation of the person's accent with ratings of pronounced, medium, slight, and none. And it asked for a rating on dress, whether the applicant was flashy, conservative, neat, or slovenly.
For those who've been stuck in the city, where concentrated poverty has exploded since the 1970s, things have gotten worse. And concentrated poverty has doubled in population from 1970 to 1990. But for those trapped in poverty, they're oftentimes trapped in the central city and isolated from opportunity, isolated from good schools, isolated from resources.
Between the young, the poor, and the elderly, 50% of our population doesn't drive. So whenever I look at a McDonald's out there on the highway or a shop, I actually say this is inaccessible to 50% of our population. Now, I also notice that there's a very nice handicap ramp. You know, we have these laws that make that building specifically accessible to the handicapped.
But do we know that actually the urbanism is preventing access by 50% of our population? It's a much higher percentage than the handicap. And yet that is effectively what it is, because the young people, they can't get there. They need to be driven by their parents. The poor people, they don't have one car per adult. You know, they need to carpool or they don't have a car at all. So the sprawl, among other things, is actually profoundly unfair to a large percentage of the population.
Sprawl throws huge obstacles in the way of those most desperate for good jobs and better places to live. Serena Fountain is typical. She is a single mother of two who lives in Detroit and works in the suburbs at EDS in Warren. But getting to work and back is a nightmare. Serena takes 10 buses each day, 5 each way, to drop her youngest child at daycare and get to work and back. Recently, she purchased a 1987 Oldsmobile, which often breaks down.
It's the winter months now, and it's very cold, and I have a 3-year-old that I also have to take with me. He walks very slowly, so 9 times out of 10, I'm having to carry him. And it's very hectic for me, sometimes depressing, and I cry. It's almost like it's not even worth to put forth the effort to do it. But, you know, again, I keep going because I'm the only one that's, you know, bringing in the income that we need to survive. As far as I can see, the jobs are in the suburbs, the better jobs. The only jobs that I've ever been able to land as far as being in the city are, you know, the restaurant jobs or jobs that pay less and things like that, which really are not paying, you know, what I need to make it. And which is why I've had to quit before. And I'm very happy with EDS. I'm happy with the group that I work with. I like what I do. But it's just the frustrating part is the transportation, what I have to go through to get to work. And I feel like once I get past that hump, I know there's going to always be something else that, you know, some other thing or hill that I'll have to get over. But for the most part right now, the transportation is my biggest issue.
Getting over a hill of unfriendly challenges in a city where good jobs are scarce, while others go begging in the suburbs.
In terms of our cities, we'll continue to lose ground in our cities. I mean, we continue to erode our cities. Unless we invest inward instead of outward, that trend is going to continue with all its manifest sociological problems: crime, education, the inability to function in the city, rising costs, poverty. And I think as a nation, we're going to continue to be distanced from ourselves. We're a nation that really hates our own society. Why else would we put up gates around our communities? Why else would we have NIMBYism in our, you know, not in my backyard? We're a nation that retreats from ourselves.
By the 1970s, racial separation and sprawl had isolated blacks to the city and placed them disproportionately in poverty. It had created a social and economic apartness, a uniquely American form of apartheid. The barriers that confine blacks to cities have been largely invisible to whites. They have become even more remote in the 1980s and 1990s as whites move even further from crisis and deeper into the outer suburbs.
When you leave, what you leave in the wake is devastation. You leave extreme poverty. You leave vacant lots. You leave declining tax base. You leave failing schools. You leave empty department stores. Well, people who can, people who really have a choice, then will leave. And so middle-class blacks and middle-class Latinos say, well, wait a minute, you know, I don't want to stay in this situation. So they move out. And when they move out, white people move further out.
Our future tragedies are the inner ring suburbs. You know, the ones that are actually becoming slums now. The immediate post-war suburbs, the Levittown vintage, they're actually losing value at a tremendous rate. And that's our next problem. Not the inner city any longer, but the inner ring suburbs. And you'll see that more and more.
These older post-World War II suburbs were not so well-built housing, 60s affordable housing, the stuff that people were moving to get the low monthly payments. Sheetrock construction, often on a grid pattern, no parks, no amenities, no downtown tax base, no real centers of culture. And as poverty hits these places, it hits them like a freight train. They're dry tinder. The schools change more rapidly. They don't have any resurgence that we see in the country right now.
It's hard to tell because actually from the outside they look kind of normal, right? It's just a house with hedges, but they're actually out of date. In the perception of the potential buyers, they're out of date and they're losing value. And there's no reason why they shouldn't end up being slums. They're wasted investment.
And as poverty and social instability cross from the city into the older suburbs, they have a tendency to accelerate and intensify. They tend to just collapse. And the largest story for the last 20 years hasn't been the depopulation of inner cities, it's been the changing nature of older suburban communities that surround central cities. They're about 25% of the US population, and they are powerfully affected. And in a time of enormous prosperity in the country, they have probably been the places that have been left behind the most and have continued to see the most downward trends during this period. You can see racial change in the inner older suburbs, racial and social change in the inner older suburbs of Detroit. And it is a part and parcel of the same process that tore apart city neighborhoods in Detroit in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. It's an unending event that continues to move into these older places. Arguably, these older places have less horsepower to deal with it.
The problem is after a century or so of this, it's now pretty difficult to live in the country and work in the city. There are just so many suburbs that have piled up in ring after ring after ring that the arithmetic doesn't work. To get from the suburb or the rural area to the city requires penetrating endless suburb between you and the city.
Well, we created a life that was dependent on the automobile. We created a life that you, in many cases, could not any longer walk to your local school or walk to your local market. Everything that you did, you had to drive to and from.
Do you know what the soccer mom is? It's just a chauffeur. It's the euphemism for a chauffeur. It used to be that the kids could actually get to the baseball field and have a pickup game. Now the parents have to make appointments. You know, we're going to the 4 o'clock game, and all the parents have to gather, deliver the kids, take the other kids to somewhere else, come and pick up the first child, and so forth. And actually, the best that you can say is that the weekends for parents are a ballet of driving the kids around in a series of appointments.
I think if you talk to a lot of people who live in suburbs, they'll say, geez, we have a nice community here. So I think it's not always true. But it is true that the farther and farther we go out, the more land we're consuming, the more cost we're adding to all the taxpayers in terms of supporting the infrastructure and the schools and the police stations, fire stations, everything else that you need to support new development. And we're sort of squandering the investment we've already made on either the inner city or the inner suburbs. We keep going farther and farther out. I think part of it is rooted in an ethic of a throwaway society, that there's somehow this notion that our resources are limitless.
It means that we're becoming less and less dense. It means that the infrastructure that we have in one place, we're not really using. We have to build new infrastructure in another place. So it's also incredibly inefficient. There's some signs that we're starting to become fed up with that. I was on a panel about a year ago with a mayor from Birmingham, which 35 years ago was an exurb. It was at the edge of the region in the Detroit metropolitan area. Now, it's an inner-ring suburb. 85% of the traffic that goes through Birmingham is pass-through. They're not stopping for gas, they're not stopping to shop, they're not stopping to go to school, they're just on their way someplace else. So Birmingham is saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not a good deal.
But basically, this American dream, I think, went awry as we fled more and more to the periphery and left the center hollowed out and empty. And so here we are. We sit with these wealthy suburbs surrounding these poor cities, and Europe has just the reverse. It has very healthy cities for the most part, fabulous transit systems, great cultural amenities, great schools, great universities. Most of them in the city. We've opted for mobility. They've opted for place.
Europe, we must realize, is actually investing heavily in its cities. And one of the results is that the wealthy live in the city, and actually the poorer people live in the suburbs.
Suburbia tends to be a private world. It's the It's the television, the family room, the automobile, the computer, the telephone. It tends to be very privatized. Perhaps the home is in a gated community. People go to private clubs, private schools. It's all about a private realm. The city has a public realm. People, I think, feel part of and even proud of something bigger than themselves. They're proud of the cathedral. They're proud of the city hall, the beautiful park, the church, the handsome high school. They love the gardens. They love the flowers in the public gardens, which, of course, don't grow in many parks anymore because cities can't afford them, because the tax base has gone to suburbia, et cetera, et cetera. We may over-romanticize cities of the past. They had their problems. But certainly a healthy city is a walkable city. Walkability might be the single best measure of urban health.
Cities have some building blocks that they can build around. They have downtown tax base that can help them. They have parks and amenities and beautiful old housing that can gentrify.
What was it about Europe's cities? The question intrigued a small group of urban designers and planners who had formed a movement called New Urbanism. American cities had functioned well once, but what had made them work? Miami planner Duany and his partner Elizabeth Plater Zyberk were among the founders of New Urbanism.
Look at what the schools used to look like in the 20s and 30s. Wonderful schools. Great Gothic buildings made out of rich, tall ceilings, wonderful materials, oak-paneled auditoriums. Now they look like insecticide factories. Poor buildings made out of visible concrete block. How is it? We're wealthier now than we were then. What happened? Well, what's happening is that we're reallocating our resources to horizontal infrastructure, to cars and sewers, to traffic and sewers, instead of vertical infrastructure, which is schools and town halls and courthouses. I mean, whenever you look at the older buildings in what was essentially a poorer America, you find marvelous vertical infrastructure, because we weren't actually spending everything, spending the entire kitty in feeding the traffic.
The integration of past and present appealed to Gaithersburg, Maryland, when it adopted Duany's plan to build Kentlands, an entirely new community on a 350-acre tract of farmland. Duany and his partners are best known for designing the towns of Seaside and Celebration in Florida.
It was really a matter of Duany trying to get the city to change our zoning regulations, change our road code. We had to do a lot of things. We had to change our whole master plan. We went through a lot of procedural stuff to make the Kentlands doable, because it just wasn't legal. The whole street pattern and the whole design of streets was, we were dealing with a post-World War II basic road code that, sought wide streets with sweeping curves and just promoted speeding. You had a series of cul-de-sacs that fed onto a residential collector street, that fed onto a larger residential collector street, which fed onto an arterial. So what it did is it funneled more and more traffic to these bigger and bigger roads. And it made the cul-de-sac itself a safe place to live, a safe haven, but it made all the other streets really dangerous. So what happened was, instead of having your kids be able to explore the neighborhood, on their bikes or otherwise, they were confined to the cul-de-sac. And he broke down that whole theory.
In a community like Kentlands, the kids have a huge range, huge. They have essentially everything. They can go to the Walmart, they can go to the Kmart, to the supermarket, to the movies, to the inn. They can have jobs in all of those stores. They have 340 acres. It's profoundly liberating for the kids.
In designing Kentlands, Duany studied Annapolis, Maryland's capital, with its tiny, winding brick streets and charming old buildings that date back to before the Revolutionary War, to the horse and carriage.
We actually study the local best streets. We measure them, we see what the setbacks are, the stoops of the buildings, how the cars are parked, how the trees are laid out, the relative ratio of height of building to width of street, and so forth. And then we emulate them. We emulate success. And what occurs is that the same behavior pattern that you can see in the older towns recurs in the newer ones, in a very predictable way. And so the streets are, and one of the things you notice about the older towns is that they don't have a lot of garage doors in front, because the garage doors are deadly. They give no information other than that cars live there. And ultimately that's boring. While if you take the car to the back and put the garage off a rear lane, then what's left in the front is actually windows, doors, stoops, porches, forecourts. Because the thing about these neo-traditional communities is that they actually serve you at every stage in your life cycle. You know, they're rental apartments when you start, and then move up houses and for children, retirement, etc., without having to leave the community. While in suburbia, you have to leave. You know, you have to, you move to a better adjusted house, a house that fits you better. But you actually have to leave the community in order to do so.
Today, Kentlands is studied as one of the models of new urbanism.
What's bizarre to me is that now when people propose, when developers propose traditional developments along the lines of new urbanism, along the lines of the way our grandparents lived, if not our parents, people now consider that a radical idea. They now take the arterial strip, the regional shopping mall, the office park, the subdivision with all its cul-de-sacs as the norm, and anything that goes against that is somehow against Americans' right and freedom to live the way they want. So, I mean, it's very ironic. What passed for urbanism for 2,000 or 3,000 years is now considered an aberration in many parts of America. There's so much ingrained in the American psyche. It is a bedrock value, this idea of freedom and choice. I would argue that there's not so much choice anymore in the typical metropolitan area. We're down to one house type pretty much across America and one apartment, garden apartment type. I mean, they pretty much look the same.
When cities like Minneapolis and Seattle adopted new urbanist ideas, they soon found that sprawl could be successfully contained. But it was Portland and Oregon that had led the way. In the 1970s, Portland had stopped inner-city decay by adopting regional growth boundaries that limited where development could go and how dense it could be.
Portland, which has been criticized by the right, you know, as some sort of antagonistic to the American dream, which is foolish. I mean, Portland is a vibrant community, and Portland is a vibrant big community because they made choices about how they would grow. They put an urban growth boundary in, they stuck to it. An urban growth boundary is a line of demarcation inside of which you develop, outside of which you don't develop.
Oregon has a wonderful land use law put in place by a Republican governor, Republican legislature, supported by large parts of the business community that changes the rules of the game and says that land outside the area that's designated for urban expansion is going to be farmland until we change the rules. And we're going to change the rules when we need the land.
Politically, Portland and the state of Oregon has made it stick, by and large. They've been very careful about how much they enlarge it as population grows. They've installed all kinds of housing choices and transportation choices to accommodate growth in that area. Instead of building $1 billion highway in the 70s and 80s, they've installed $1 billion light rail lines. They developed communities, not just parking lots around the station stops, but they actually houses, shops, professional centers, all walkable to each station stop so that people can have choices about how they get around.
Minneapolis adopted a regional system of government that included sharing tax revenue, an area-wide public transit system that brings suburbanites downtown and shuttles city dwellers out to work and shop in the suburbs, but not without a fight.
It was a terrible battle. And again, you know, I'm a Democrat, but it was led by a bunch of Republicans. And they fought a terrible battle in the Minnesota legislature. It took them 3 sessions. They passed it by a narrow margin. Communities that didn't like it brought lawsuits all the way up to the United States Supreme Court against it, which the Supreme Court upheld. You know, in a per curiam opinion, they upheld our system.
Metropolitan regions need to be governed in some sort of metropolitan fashion. That if all the tax base flees along with the people to the wealthy second-ring suburbs, leaving behind the poverty and all the social problems that go along with it in the inner city without the tax base, you get a polarized metropolitan region. And that just feeds on itself.
Which is what happened to Detroit. By the 1980s, the relationship between city and suburbs was so strained that studies began finding that Metro Detroit was the single most racially polarized city in the country.
It seems to me that that unfortunately in Michigan we have built a huge rift between the state and Detroit. And we've let that rift widen over the course of the last several years. I think it is a rift that was built in part by racial differences. It is a rift that exists in part because of just expenditure differences, tax-based differences. I've got mine, you know, I don't want to give you any more. But it's a rift that's got to be healed. If Michigan is to be healthy, then Detroit's got to be healthy.
For 20 years, sprawl and its destructive effects have been low on the agenda of most state governments. Michigan has stressed other issues.
Politically, this is tough stuff. Politically, it's tough stuff because our government at every level still is focused on helping, assisting at any cost, business and economic development. And so when citizens come forward and ask about these other social values, quality of life, environmental protection, you know, equity issues, how we live, whether we need to have 100 acres for that or 10 acres for the same thing, that is seen as antagonistic to this goal, which is government economic growth at any cost. And that economic growth at any cost is producing this kind of, you know, distortions in how we live.
So what does the future hold for older cities like Detroit?
The cities are being rediscovered by a younger generation for whom the promise of suburbia, in fact, was not delivered. These are the kids that grew up in suburbia now. You know, the Generation Xers. And they're saying, so what's so great about a house with a 3-car garage? It's a drag. It's completely boring, and they want to be in cities again. These people who know the suburb too well, and its failed promises, and it just holds no magic.
Grand Rapids, a bastion of Republican conservatism, may seem an unlikely city to be on the cutting edge of new urbanism.
Grand Rapids, 10 years ago, took advantage of a then new statute to create the first and only metropolitan council in the state. We now have 31 member units of government in a 7-county area. Grand Rapids is at the heart of 47 local units of government that collectively spend $625 million a year. In fact, more than that now. That figure is somewhat dated. There are 637 elected officials that make up Metropolitan Grand Rapids. That's a very interesting figure because that's exactly 100 more elected officials than run the entire United States. We have 435 congressmen, 100 senators, a president and a vice president, all elected by the people to run the entire country. That's 537 people. So one aspect of sprawl that people need to come to grips with and understand is this multiplicity of government, creating little fiefdoms, little bastions of this and that oftentimes don't want to work together.
Business leadership supports these things. It's sensible. It's good planning. And I think in Grand Rapids, you have a kind of a conservative, pragmatic group of people that are beginning to say, hey, we can't just fight little tribal wars amongst each other. We've got to raise this whole region up to compete in the world economy.
Interestingly enough, in the dark old days of downtown urban renewal, the city fathers thought it was prudent to write housing out of downtown. I mean, it disappeared in the code, in the zoning code, crazy as that sounds. There was a time here when I'd come back from college in the late 50s, you could take a bowling ball and roll it down any sidewalk in downtown at almost any time after 5 o'clock of any day and all day on the weekend, secure in the knowledge you'd never hit the leg of anybody. There's nobody there.
Grand Rapids earmarked boarded-up factories and industrial sites for apartments and high-rise condo units. 5,000 new units of housing were slotted to be built downtown by 2003. So far, 3,000 are either built or near completion. Builder Sam Cummings, a convert to new urbanism, has turned several old warehouse buildings into airy loft apartments and condos.
We began to see the potential in a lot of the neighboring buildings that were, decrepit, pigeon-infested, and hadn't been occupied for several years. And this is really sort of when the new urbanism movement was really sort of taking hold nationally and in other cities. And other cities like New York were experiencing, huge growth in areas like Soho.
Pat Kellogg is a 63-year-old widow who is typical of those moving into downtown Grand Rapids.
I felt unsafe in the suburbs, especially when I come home after dark and drive in the garage. Even though I had my bright lights on, there were too many places if somebody wanted to hide that they could. And it's just the opposite down here. It's well lit, lots of people around, and I feel very comfortable coming into this parking lot and coming in my back door. Before, I was living in a house that I'd been in for 40 years, raised our children, and had flower garden, yard, and so forth in the township, outside of Grand Rapids, Plainfield Township. And when I decided I was going to move downtown, well, my brother, for one, he says, have you gone around the bend? I can walk. I walk along the river. There's a nice path, and it's about a mile down and a mile back. If I walked in the suburbs, I had to cross busy highways, and it looked like if you're walking there that your car broke down. It just wasn't conducive to walking. And I can walk two places. I can walk for a reason. I can go to the, get a paper down at the hotel. I can go up the hill and go to the deli and pick up some things. I can do some shopping around here in the food markets. I can go to the museums.
We were living in a nice two-bedroom house with a lawn and neighbors close by and a lot of kids in the neighborhood, and there's actually ice cream trucks that came up and down the street. So I mean, it was nice, but you know, we don't have kids, and we just thought, first of all, condo living would probably suit our lifestyle, and we looked around. Definitely downtown living was what we wanted.
When I told my parents we were moving downtown or thinking about it, they thought we were nuts. Because this area of town used to be called, or is called the Hartside District, and it was more known as Skid Row. All these buildings were abandoned, and my parents, being older, you know, remember it that way. They don't keep in touch with what's been going on down here and all the redevelopment, so they thought we were out of our minds. We seldom use our car now during the weekends and at night, because there's usually enough places around here that we can go to without driving out.
Now it's vibrant. We've got the new arena. We're building a new convention center. We've got 17 new restaurants in downtown. I've got 6 old warehouses that have come back to life with both entertainment features on the first floor and offices on the second. Jane Jacobs said it best. 40 years ago, in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, nobody was listening, just like nobody was listening to Rachel Carson about the environment 5 years earlier. She said, you gotta have people living in downtown if you're gonna have a successful downtown.
The Metro Council is not anti-growth. Any efforts we're doing here is not anti-growth. You know, personally, I think growth is very good. But again, some control, some pattern growth, where should growth occur, I think is probably the impetus now. But we've got a lot of activities that all tie into what some might say is an anti-sprawl agenda, certainly not anti-growth. It's a pro-growth, anti-inefficient growth pattern.
I think that what Grand Rapids has done is just fantastic. It's the first steps toward cooperation on a regional basis between the number of local units of government that you have there. I wish it could be replicated in Detroit, but I think the racial divisions in Southeast Michigan are so great that you simply can't do it there. A large part of this problem of land use and of cooperation between cities is really racially driven, and we've got to get over that in this state.
Anybody that doesn't think that race and racism is a problem in this society today is simply fooling themselves.
If we're going to address these issues right, we have to really understand how race has played and continue to play an important role in both fragmentation and sprawl.
If we do not create regional land use patterns, we will get the reverse. We will get little islands. We will get balkanization. We will get what I call playing castle. Castle is played this way, from some suburb back toward the core. We're in the castle, you're not. We're going to keep the drawbridge up, and we aren't going to feed the alligators in the moat.
And I think a lot of us are looking around and thinking that we're beginning to foul our own nest, and that the way we've been developing this country is not the best way, that we have children and grandchildren, and we have a legacy, and we don't like the legacy we're leaving today, and maybe there's still time to stop what we're doing and protect that legacy for our children.
Next on public television stations, The Sprawling of America looks at how suburbs exploded in The Fat of the Land.
The other piece of it, I think, is the sense of loss. The competition for land on the suburban fringe. That is that people who are living there, have been living there for a while, feel an aesthetic, moral, heart-rending loss when they turn around and the 400-acre field next to them is literally converted to some mega mall in a space of 90 days.